This is the KMA device's ENDGAME, one of the more interesting pedal-based products that I have seen recently. There's new firmware for it, which adds some new features, but if you're unfamiliar with this, it's a utility device, a problem solver, and a tone enhancer. The headline feature, I think, for myself and a lot of other people, is the stereo double tracker, which is powered by machine learning algorithms. There's also a stereo IR loader on here. You get 3 built-in IRs. You've got Celestion IRs for that. You've got a Vintage 30 greenback and creamback. Then there's 2 user slots on there as well. You've got an input and a through on there, then a stereo effects loop that you can place before or after the doubler. On the other side, you've got a stereo XLR outs that you can change the level on from mic level to line level. So it's a stereo DI. There's also stereo TS or TRS outputs on here. There's dual headphone outputs on here, an auxiliary in, and Bluetooth connectivity, so you can stream audio to this. So there's so many different use cases for this, but what I want to explore today is the concept of the doubler, mostly on here, and how you can use it to basically make your live tones wider, girthier, and a little more album-like. Then we'll go through a bunch of the other features on here. There's an ambience control for like a room-style reverb. You can select where you have the double tracking or the IR simulation in the signal chain. And there's also built-in power amp simulation in here. So whether you're using this with an existing modeler, whether you're using, say, a little hybrid rig like this, where I've got a Friedman IRJ and a bunch of pedals, if you wanted to integrate the IRJ with, say, a Fractal VP4, which we'll take a look at, this can sort of be the centerpiece of your pedal board. It can take your live rig and turn it into a really easy practice rig. You could use it to run in-ears as well. There's so much to get through, so we may as well dive straight in. I've got a Les Paul Custom plugged into the IRJ. I have disabled the IRJ's built-in cab sims. I'm taking its balanced output into the main input of the ENDGAME. The stereo XLR outputs from the ENDGAME are going into my audio interface with no post-processing. Let's have a listen to the built-in cab sims on the ENDGAME, and then I've loaded up my free cab IR into the first user slot. So we will hear that one again. I've just got this set up for a big dirty rock crunch. After this, we're going to explore the doubler. You also heard on there that I blended in a little bit of ambience with this control here. This can be great, especially if you're playing on headphones or in-ears, just to push the guitar back a little bit and give it some space. Let's try the doubler now. The latest firmware does add some extra controls so that you can tweak the doubler, basically making the tracking tighter or looser, as well as controlling the overall double tone level. I'll show you how to do that in a second, but to start with, the main control is this width control over here. So it's gonna make your guitar sound wider and girthier. In a live context, especially in a trio, this is gonna give you more of that album style tone on there, especially when we combine it with the effects loop for some delay and reverb. But for now, let's just have a listen to what it does. I'll start with the width control. At noon, I have both of these mini toggles in the up or pre position on there. Let's have a listen to what we get. is a pretty fantastic sounding doubler on there. Having it all the way out wide is awesome, but I think probably somewhere around 70 to 80%, for my taste anyway, is what I like. It's really natural sounding, and if you've tried other kind of faux doubling techniques like using a really short delay pan to one side or a reverb pan to one side or something like the TC Electronic Mimic, this doesn't have any weird artifacts in there, and it just does make everything kind of wider, but also deeper and girthier the way you'd get, say, double tracking on an album. So this would be pretty amazing to use in a live context. I think the only thing that I've heard that's kind of close to this would be using some stereo pitch detune, but the pitch detune does have that kind of 80s flavor about it. And if you like that, like I do, that's great. But if you were playing stuff that's, say, modern metal, or you want something that doesn't sound like a static chorus, this is probably the way to go. That's pretty amazing on there. There are 2 extra controls that you can access in this firmware by pressing and holding the foot switches. So if you press and hold the doubler foot switch while turning the width control, you get tighter or looser tracking on there. I'll let you hear the extremes on there. So let's do this. Let's hold down this control, and I'm going to twist this width to around, what is that, 9 o'clock on there. We'll take the width itself all the way out. Then I'm going to press and hold that and turn this control all the way up, and we will have a looser tracking on there. Again, we'll hear it without. This is one of those effects that you really miss it when you turn it off. The default settings would be to have that tight or looseness at about noon. I like it slightly tighter on there, and again with the width just backed off from its maximum width. You can control the overall doubled level in there by doing a similar process. You press and hold the effects loop button and then turn this up or down. The default will be at noon. So let's start with the doubler a lot lower on there, then I will crank it up. I do have to say, I think noon is a pretty good starting point, but once you start playing around with the placement of the doubler, you might want to tweak that. Addictive. I'm going to park the doubler at my favorite setting there around 3 o'clock. Let's use the effects loop now to add some stereo effects, and we can have the doubling effect either before or after the effects loop on here. I think the classic use case would be running the doubler before you go out to your delays and reverbs, but we can easily play around with the placement just by flicking this switch over here. So when I turn the effects loop on, it's going to kick in my Fractal VP4 in stereo. At the moment, I'm using a stereo multi-tap delay and a plate style reverb. So I'm going to take this ambience control all the way off. This is going to sound like a big greasy lead tone on here, and then I'm going to kick in the doubler before it, and then we'll try the doubler after it. This is one of those things which is really easy to cater to your taste. Like I said earlier, I think most people would want to have this set to pre-effects loop, but an interesting effect that I've kind of stumbled across is using a big, thick plate style reverb and actually placing the doubler after that. So it's going to play around with the stereo image of the reverb a little bit. Let's hear it pre and then post. Stacking the delay on there, it's like a little bit of an unintended consequence, but to me that sounds even thicker and bigger. And again, if you were using a rig like this in the studio and doing a lot of multi-tracking, and then want to take the same rig out and play it live, but get that big stereo width and girth, this is a pretty great way to do it. Furthermore, you can see that this is also providing us a stereo DI. And if I want to change the cab sim sound, I can just twist that knob on there. And one thing that you might like to try with these two user slots would be, say, to have a raw unprocessed IR on there, and then one that's heavily EQ'd, so that if you were playing in a venue where you've got a fully featured mixing desk and time to do a detailed sound check, then you can get that dialed in with the IR wide open. But if you're playing in a venue where you don't have time to do that, you can kind of have an IR that's got all that EQ source baked into it, so that you can just plug and play and again have more of a polished kind of album ready finished tone happening on there. Another thing that I really like about the ENDGAME is there's IR loading and power amp simulation. So if you're using a preamp, I've got a lot of old rack preamps, and I've got a Synergy and a Soldano X88 set up here, as well as preamp pedals, and you wanted to use this on the end of your board, I guess, to transform a pedal board that would normally run into an amp into a DI board, you can use those power amp sims. Running a preamp with IRs generally sounds a little bit flat, and it kind of lacks the low and high end resonance that you get from the impedance interactions between a power amp and a cab. So they're modeling that with a couple of different tube power sections. For this, I've plugged in the Soldano X88 IR. While that does have its own power amp sims and IRs, I'm bypassing both of those. I'm just using it like a typical preamp, again, into my free IR. It sounds okay to start, but I think it sounds much better with these power amp sims. The ENDGAME also has an auxiliary in and Bluetooth, so if you wanted to use this to practice along to backing tracks or jam out to your favorite songs, or say go to the Leon Todd Patreon and bring up some of the free backing tracks on there and jam along to them, you could do that really easily. There's also a control for the auxiliary in volume. You could also use this as an in-ear solution because there's two headphone outputs on here as well as the XLR outs, and you can choose whether this auxiliary or Bluetooth connection goes to the XLR outs or just the headphones on there. So this would let you integrate backing tracks or an in-ears feed on here pretty seamlessly. For now, let's just have a quick little jam to this. I'm gonna bring in the VP4 for some stereo effects. Then I'm gonna add the doubler to all of this. ENDGAME just had stereo IR loading, the DI and the effects loop capabilities on there, I think it would still be worth looking at for a lot of people as a great problem solver and utility device, but it's got that amazing sounding doubler on there, so you can take your live tones to the next level or even just practice with more of an album style tone. And it's also got the extra routing capabilities like the Bluetooth, the auxiliary in, the multiple headphone outputs on there. It's got a drive-through, so if you wanted to use this, say, with a loaded down head for a wet, dry, wet setup, you could do that on there. It's a really great combination, like I said, of those utility problem-solving devices, but also really forward-thinking ideas on there. The doubler sounds amazing. It's really easy to use as well. It doesn't give you that typical modeler option paralysis thing. I think it would be a great add-on to a modeler just for the doubler alone on there, or if you've got a sort of, let's say, cheaper modeler that doesn't have XLR outputs on it, you could use this as kind of a bolt on there. I've got a lot of ideas about how I want to use this particular device in my rig. I think to get started just using it in the studio, it's just going to be super handy to have those stereo outputs, the doubler, and the ability to add wet effects, say, to a loaded down head or to my rack. But I'm really tempted to try this live as an alternative to the kind of normal stereo micro shift thing that I like to do, and just see what I like better in a live context. And again, because it's so easy to integrate into the rig, it genuinely makes me excited about what I can do with this. Let me know your thoughts on the ENDGAME in the comment section below. How would you use this in your rig? What problems would it solve? Kind of what opportunities would it open up to sort of enhance your tones in the studio and live? I'll put more information about it in the video description, along with the links to my Patreon and the music that I make with my band Ragdoll. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all on the next one.